A lot of time and effort goes into creating videos like this, so if you're enjoying the content, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.
The scrap leather belt, makers of the Missouri boot heel. When store belts cracked and pants sagged in 1935, sharecropper families in the boot heel cut scrap leather from old harnesses into sturdy belts that held up clothes and bartered for essentials. They punched holes with heated nails, buckled with wire from fences, and tooled patterns with knife tips for belts that lasted through field work. A belt traded for a sack of meal or a doctor's tonic. The tough strap kept dignity cinched when hope loosened. Boys punched holes even. Mothers stitched keepers from boot tongues for finish. Those leather scraps belted resilience through cotton rows and later cinched post-war uniforms when new leather arrived. In 1877, across the Texas Hill Country, the open range was disappearing behind barbed wire fences. Wealthy cattle ranchers called small settlers nesters, while families raising goats and farming small patches of land were treated like trespassers on country they had lived beside for years. The Blevins family survived by raising goats near a small creek deep in the hills. Thomas Blevins, 47 years old and a former Confederate soldier who survived Vicksburg, lived there with his wife Martha and their 5 children. They owned nearly 200 goats, but held no formal deed to the land itself, only old water rights connected to the creek running beside their cabin. Then the fencing began. A large cattle company enclosed nearly 50,000 acres with barbed wire. Cutting directly across the creek the Blevins family depended on. Water access vanished. Grazing land disappeared. Goats began dying beneath the Texas heat. Thomas responded by cutting the fences at night. Free grass, he called it. The ranchers called it theft. Soon, armed riders appeared near the homestead. One summer night, they burned the goat pens, shot dozens of animals, and left behind a warning for Thomas. Next time, it's you. Still, the family refused to leave. Thomas rebuilt the pens using brush and scrap wood, while Martha began making goat cheese by hand, carrying it into town and selling wheels for 5 cents each, just to keep food on the table. That winter, a Texas Ranger arrived and informed the family they were now living on leased cattle land and had to move immediately. Thomas produced an old 1870 water right document proving the creek belonged to his family. The ranger tore the paper apart in front of him. New law, he said. But the Blevins family stayed anyway. In March 1878, 15 mounted riders arrived before sunrise. They dragged Thomas outside, beat him in front of his wife and children, tied a rope around his neck, and hanged him from a live oak tree before riding away believing he was dead. Martha cut him down herself. Thomas survived, but the damage to his neck remained for the rest of his life, leaving his voice permanently weakened. Martha gathered the children and the remaining goats and walked nearly 90 miles to San Antonio, selling the surviving animals for $1 each while taking laundry work to survive. Eventually, Thomas recovered enough strength to haul freight through town. Because speaking caused him pain, he wrote instructions and deliveries on a small slate instead. When he died in 1899, Martha secretly carried his body back into the hill country at night and buried him beneath the same oak tree where they had once tried to kill him. Into the bark she carved, TB 1878, cut down, stayed up. Years later, one of their sons built one of the largest goat operations in the region and eventually purchased the same ranch that had fenced the family out decades earlier. The first thing he did after signing the papers was tear the fences down. All of them, he said. Then he looked across the open land and quietly told the workers, "Daddy couldn't talk. This talks for him." October 1938, Scottsbluff, Nebraska. The Great Western Sugar Company, the beet harvest, the Garcia family, Father Luis Garcia, 44, Mother Carmen, 41, and 9 kids. They were migrant workers. The pay was $1.50 a ton. The company cut it to $1.25. October 3rd, the workers struck. The beets were in the ground. The frost was coming. The company said work or leave the camp. The camp was company houses. Luis took his 18-year-old, 16-year-old, and 14-year-old sons to the picket line. The sheriff came October 5th. He had deputies. They had clubs. The company said the beets would rot. Luis said the pay would not feed us. The sheriff swung. The 16-year-old took the hit. He broke his arm. Carmen was in the house with the 6 younger kids, 12 down to 3. The sheriff nailed the eviction notice to the door. It said 6 p.m. She took the kids and the mattress and went to the church. The priest opened the hall. The strike held 10 days. The company came back to $1.40. The family went back. The 18-year-old Juan went to the army in 1942. He was at Normandy. He said, "We struck for a quarter. I fought for the country." Carmen kept the notice. It was torn. The Dust Bowl, Mother, Oklahoma, 1935. The sky turned black with dust, and the earth cracked beneath bare feet. In 1935, the Dust Bowl swept across Oklahoma, swallowing farms and forcing families into despair. Among them was Ruth Miller, a young mother of 3 who clung to hope as the wind tore apart everything she and her husband had built. Their wheat crop had withered to nothing, the cattle lay dead in the fields, and each day Ruth stuffed wet rags under the doors to keep the choking dust from filling their lungs. Her husband traveled from town to town searching for work, leaving Ruth to hold the family together in their sagging farmhouse. She became resourceful in ways hardship demanded. She boiled tumbleweeds for supper, patched children's clothes from flour sacks, and traded eggs for kerosene when the lamps ran dry. At night, she whispered lullabies over the roar of the wind, telling her children stories of greener fields, even as her own faith faltered. One terrible afternoon, when a black blizzard swept in like a wall, Ruth grabbed her children, covered their faces with damp cloths, and led them into the storm cellar. For hours, they huddled together in darkness as dust pounded against the wooden doors. When at last the winds died, Ruth emerged with her children, covered in grit but alive. Though the Dust Bowl drove thousands westward, Ruth stayed. She planted a small garden with seeds given by neighbors, coaxing life from soil that seemed dead. Her determination became a quiet act of defiance, proof that even when the land broke, a mother's will could endure. Calloused hands, young hearts. In the mountain hollows, childhood ended the moment a boy could swing a hoe or a girl could carry a bucket. The Great Depression didn't spare the young. It drafted them into the front lines of survival. On the misty hillsides of Kentucky, children with hands already calloused and weathered beyond their years tended to goats and hauled water from distant springs. They were the small, sturdy pillars of the mountain economy. They didn't have toys or school books in those desperate winter months. They had chores that kept the family alive. They spent their days in the dirt, hoeing the rocky soil and foraging for wild greens and mushrooms in the deep woods. Ginseng roots were hunted like treasure, traded for the basic necessities that kept the cabin running. It was a hard, gritty upbringing that stripped away the softness of youth, replacing it with a stoic endurance. These children weren't just helping out. They were the heartbeat of a community that refused to perish. Their small hands were the architects of Appalachian endurance. The Route 66, Families of Oklahoma, 1934. By 1934, thousands of families throughout Oklahoma were leaving drought-damaged farms and traveling west along Route 66, searching for survival. Dust storms destroyed crops, livestock weakened from hunger, and banks reclaimed farmland that families had worked for decades. Entire households loaded what little remained into worn trucks and wagons, hoping California might offer work, food, and another chance to rebuild their lives. The Dalton family joined the growing migration after losing their wheat farm outside Elk City. Their truck carried blankets, cooking pots, jars of preserved food, and nearly every possession they still owned secured beneath canvas covers. Along the highway, roadside camps filled with other migrant families sleeping beside broken vehicles and preparing meals over open fires while children wandered through blowing dust and heat. Gas stations, churches, and roadside diners became temporary stopping points for exhausted travelers slowly crossing the country. Some families traded labor for gasoline or meals, while others sold personal belongings simply to continue another few miles westward. Even during hardship, migrants frequently shared water, tools, and information about jobs rumored to exist farther down the road. For many children, Route 66 became both a pathway and an uncertain home. They slept beside highways, crossed deserts packed into overloaded vehicles, and watched parents struggle daily to keep families together through poverty and constant movement. One migrant mother later remembered, "We didn't leave looking for adventure. We left because the land could no longer feed our children." The Henderson farmhouse was gone. The barn had collapsed after years of dust storms. The fences had disappeared beneath drifting soil. By spring, there was almost nothing left. Almost. One thing still stood beside the lonely road, a weathered wooden mailbox. Every week, despite having no house to deliver to, old mail carrier Frank Miller stopped his horse beside it. He opened the little door. Sometimes there was a letter, sometimes a newspaper, sometimes nothing at all. Travelers often laughed. "Why are you delivering mail to an empty farm?" Frank smiled. "Because somebody still calls this place home." One windy afternoon, 12-year-old Lucy Henderson returned with her mother to gather a few belongings. She noticed a small envelope inside the mailbox. It was addressed simply, "To whoever comes home first." Inside was a handwritten note from a neighboring farmer. "If you ever decide to come back, you won't be rebuilding alone." Lucy folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket. Years passed. The rains returned. In 1942, the Henderson family came home. The farmhouse had to be built again from the ground up. Neighbors arrived carrying lumber, nails, hammers, and hope. The very first thing Lucy's father rebuilt was the mailbox. When someone asked why he didn't begin with a house, he smiled. "Because hope needs an address. Sometimes a home disappears, but as long as someone is still waiting for you, it is never truly lost." The Porch Light, Woodward, Oklahoma. October 1938. Every night just before bed, Sarah Collins lit the kerosene lantern on her front porch. Her husband smiled. "You know we're wasting fuel." Sarah adjusted the wick. "I know." "Then why do you keep lighting it?" She looked toward the dark road disappearing into the prairie. "So nobody feels alone." Word quietly spread across the county. If a traveler became trapped after sunset, or a family was forced off the road by another black blizzard, the Collins farmhouse could always be found by its porch light. No questions asked, no payment expected. One freezing November night, there was a knock at the door. Outside stood a young couple with two exhausted children. Their truck had broken an axle 20 miles away. Sarah welcomed them inside before they could explain. Hot soup, dry blankets, a place beside the stove. By morning, the storm had passed. The father tried to offer a few coins. Sarah gently closed his hand. "Someday, leave your own light on." 25 years later, the couple's grown daughter bought a farmhouse in Nebraska. The very first thing she installed was a lantern hook beside the front door. Her children once asked, "Why do we always leave the porch light burning?" She smiled toward the road. "Because someone did the same for us." History remembers the great storms, the failed harvests, the endless migration. But somewhere, in the darkness between those stories, there was always a small porch light waiting for strangers to become guests. The first snow arrived mixed with dust. Gray flakes fell onto brown fields. The children at Prairie View School arrived shivering. Many wore coats too small for them. Some wore none at all. Miss Helen Carter noticed everything: the thin gloves, the holes in boots, the children pretending they weren't cold. She knew most families were choosing between food and winter clothing. There simply wasn't enough money for both. That weekend, Miss Carter boarded a bus to Amarillo. She carried nearly her entire year's savings in a small envelope. The money she had planned to use for a new stove, a better mattress, maybe even a trip home. Instead, she spent every dollar on coats, scarves, mittens, socks, and wool blankets. On Monday morning, the children found packages stacked beside their desks. No names, no explanation, just gifts. 8-year-old Tommy stared at the new coat folded beside his chair. "It's mine?" Miss Carter smiled. "If it fits." The coat was slightly too large. Tommy grinned. "Then I'll grow into it." For the rest of the winter, no child at Prairie View arrived without something warm to wear. The families never discovered exactly who paid for everything. Miss Carter never told them. Years later, Tommy became a teacher himself. One winter morning, he noticed a student arriving without gloves. The next day, a new pair mysteriously appeared on the child's desk. No note, no explanation, just kindness. When people asked Tommy why he chose teaching, he often thought about one snowy morning in 1936. A teacher who quietly spent her savings so children could feel warm, not just in their hands, but in their hearts. The Henderson farmhouse was gone. The barn had collapsed after years of dust storms. The fences had disappeared beneath drifting soil. By spring, there was almost nothing left. Almost. One thing still stood beside the lonely road, a weathered wooden mailbox. Every week, despite having no house to deliver to, old mail carrier Frank Miller stopped his horse beside it. He opened the little door. Sometimes there was a letter, sometimes a newspaper, sometimes nothing at all. Travelers often laughed. "Why are you delivering mail to an empty farm?" Frank smiled. "Because somebody still calls this place home." One windy afternoon, 12-year-old Lucy Henderson returned with her mother to gather a few belongings. She noticed a small envelope inside the mailbox. It was addressed simply, "To whoever comes home first." Inside was a handwritten note from a neighboring farmer. "If you ever decide to come back, you won't be rebuilding alone." Lucy folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket. Years passed. The rains returned. In 1942, the Henderson family came home. The farmhouse had to be built again from the ground up. Neighbors arrived carrying lumber, nails, hammers, and hope. The very first thing Lucy's father rebuilt was the mailbox. When someone asked why he didn't begin with the house, he smiled. Because hope needs an address. Sometimes a home disappears. But as long as someone is still waiting for you, it is never truly lost.